When you're doing up a room, it's the finishing touches that can make all the difference, like the mouldings. If you're doing up an old room, you can reuse your existing mouldings. You'll save a bundle and it'll keep the original character of the room. Or if you're after a new look, there are plenty of new mouldings to choose from. For this job, I'm going to be installing new mouldings, skirting along the bottom, scotia at the top, and architraves around the door and window. Okay, these are our pre-primed architraves straight out of the factory. Now, we're going to do our door first. The reason we do this is because once the architraves are on, all our skirtings can butt up to it. Now, what we're going to do first, just make sure that there's nothing on the floor, there's no old bits of paint or anything, so that sits nice and square, hard down on the floor. That's all looking lovely. I've already pre-cut that square on the end. Now, what we're going to look for is a 3mm quirk. Now, a quirk is the distance from the edge of the architrave up to our door jamb. Now, the reason we give ourselves a quirk, if I was to put that architrave flush with the edge of our door jamb, after a while the timber's going to move, the paint's going to crack, the door's going to be slammed after a while, and you're going to be left with quite an open gap, and that looks pretty ugly. So what we're doing, by moving that over about 3mm, it doesn't look so bad if the door was to move or the architraves is going to sort of open up a little bit. So in our case here, we're going to go for a 3mm quirk. So I'm going to come up from the bottom of my door jamb, 3mm. I'm going to put a little mark there on my architrave. That indicates the short point of my mitre. So just to help us out when we get to our drop saw and cut it, we're just going to put a line going down that way, just so I remember when I get over there, my 45 degree goes on that angle there. Now, so that's my left side. My top, I've already pre-cut a 45 degree on one end, so this is going to help me out. Now, that just sits on there, and remembering to keep our 3mm gap from the edge of our jamb to the side of where our new architrave will sit. And we come over to the other side here, and once again we allow a 3mm quirk. Mark that, that's our short point of the mitre, and help ourselves out, indicating which way our mitre is going to go. So we've done our top and our left. Now our right hand side is exactly the same as the left, sitting that nice and square on the ground. We allow 3mm, that's the short point on my mitre, and that's the way our angle is going to go. So, right, we can take these out to a drop saw, cut all these in one, bring them back in, ready for pinning on. Now it's a good idea to cut all the mitres on your architraves at the same time. Okay, I'm pinning my architraves on with a good old trusty pin gun there, but there's nothing wrong with using your hammer and some finishing nails. We're starting at the bottom and working our way up. That way we're just following the contour of the door jamb, ensuring that we've got our 3mm gap the whole way up. That's going to form our lovely little 3mm quirk. Rightio, when you're putting these nails in, you just want to make sure they actually work in pairs. One's going in the door jamb and one's actually going into our stud. So a lot of these old doors, there's only a couple of nails that are holding them. So what we're doing is ensuring that that door jam's not going to move anymore. So don't be afraid to give it plenty of nails. We can always fill them in later. Okay, our top piece. Okay, so what we do, good old trusty little bit of PVA there. Okay, we've put our PVA on. Let's just marry that joint up. Now, we just repeat the same for our last architrave. A little bit of PVA on there. And this time, we're going to start from the top and work our way down. Just assuring all the time that we've got a nice even 3mm quirk. Now here's a little tip for you. When you come close to our door handle, don't put your nail right where your door handle is, because if you're ever going to change that out later and you're going to be chiseling into your door jamb, what you're going to find, you're going to end up striking your nail. So you can happily go straight up above it and below it, just don't put it right in the middle. Okay, lastly, we've got to do, we'll clean off that PVA, and if you feel unhappy with that join, you give that a really light little sand, and then we just go along and fill our nail holes and ready for our top coat. Okay, that's architraves done. Time to hit our skirtings. Right, there's two walls you take into consideration when you're starting off your skirting. The first one is the wall directly opposite your door, the wall that you're going to see first. The next one is the wall next to your door. So let's have a measure up. 2 meters and 38. Rightio, so I'm going to go and cut this and fix that back in. Okay, we've measured our first wall. Made a mark on our skirting here. Now that is going to be a square cut on both ends. Okay, just before we rock into putting our skirting down, we just want to make sure that our floor is nice and level. So we've got our trusty Linbide scraper. And let's just take away any old glue or a bit of build up of varnish. Sweet. Once again, trusty little bit of PVA. Now with our PVA, you can glue the back of the skirting if you like, but I prefer only to glue where it's butting up against our architrave or another piece of skirting. Let's just sit that in there. Now a good little tip when you're doing your skirting, just to make sure that the skirting gets hard down onto your floor, take an old piece of 3x1, sit that gently on top of the skirting, and just put a little bit of pressure on that. That comes down nice and tight up against the floor. Another little tip for you also when you're fixing pins into your skirting, into the wall, you want to make sure that you use the pins that are just enough to go into the framing itself. If you're going too long, you might not know where any of your pipes or wires are. You certainly don't want to hit anything you shouldn't. So you don't want it to go into the framing any more than about 10-15 millimeters, about the thickness of this board that we've got here now. Now it's time to measure up the skirting between the two walls I've already done. I'll need to make an overscribe on the ends, which creates the illusion of having a mitre and helps hide any gaps that may appear later. I'll show you how to do it. Okay, so I've just cut a mitre on one end of our skirting. This is for our overscribe. Now all you do is cut that on 45 degrees, and we use our nice little trusty coping saw here. And just slightly undercutting, we work our way up that short point. Sometimes it's a little bit easier if you grab your pencil and just use that to highlight that edge so you can see it nice and crispy. Yeah, just really carefully take yourself up to that mark and then come back to our top point. Now that should fit quite nicely into our other piece of skirting. Once your first end is overscribed, then measure the length of the skirting. Okay, you've seen how to cut the nice plain skirting. If you've got the slightly fancier skirting, I'm going to show you how to overscribe that as well. Okay, so we're still cutting our 45 degrees. And once again, I just use the old pencil, highlight that edge. And you just want to slightly undercut it, not too radically, but not square, but just slightly undercut. So the only point that actually touches is that short point there. It's a really good idea to practice overscribing on an offcut. Carefully follow the profile of the skirting. Now that skirting there just overscribes that beautifully. That there, very simply, is how you do an overscribe on your skirting. Okay, so we've cut our nice little overscribe there. Let's just very gently lower that down and marry that up with our existing one. And that just butts in there quite nicely. Obviously we're going to put some glue on there, and now we're ready to pin it. Now the good thing about this overscribe is it looks like it's a 45 degrees, so it keeps it nice and tidy. We've got our 45 degree cut on the top there, and if the room was to move whatsoever, that's going to hide any sort of a movement, no gaps whatsoever. So if we were to put a 45 degree on both of those skirtings, the room only has to move slightly and you're going to get a big gaping gap you're going to see from every part of the room. But if the room was to move, once we've done our overscribe, you'd have to actually come right down the side here to look into it. So that's the reason for our overscribe. So I've nailed my last piece of skirting on. Now it's time to start the scotia. Rightio, when you're measuring up for your scotia, same thing as your skirting. Measure the wall straight opposite the door first, and then the wall straight above your door. Now a good little tip when you're measuring for your scotia, you don't have to worry about going the whole way. Let's just come round about halfway, butt that in. If you're working on your own, this is quite nice and handy. I've got 1.7 on the right, let's just write that down so we don't forget. And measuring for the left, we've got 1.6, 1632. 1632. So add those up and that gives us the exact length of our scotia. Cut your first lengths of scotia square. So here's my lovely square cut scotia. Now when you're putting the scotia up, you know we've got a top plate, and I know in the ceiling I've got a nog that's running all the way around, so I don't have to try and locate my rafters for the pins. Just have to note to try and get that back nice and tight. With these old wobbly ceilings, you just got to do your best to try and pull that in as much as you can. For our second piece of scotia, we'll need to cut an overscribe like we did for the skirting. I'll show you how to do this. Okay, I've just measured my scotia. Now, quick little tip when you're cutting this profiled scotia. At the bottom, when you look up, you're going to see 45 degrees. So you want to make sure you have a 45 degree on the bottom. Our cut is going to go that way with square on that end. And it's always a really good tip to do that before you cut it because it's really easy to stuff up. So I've got my 45 degree on the bottom, square cut on there. I've tilted my saw over on 45 degrees. That way I know I'm going to get a square cut there and 45 on the bottom. So lovely. That's the first part of my overscribe. Once again, let's just use our pencil And with our trusty coping saw, and I'm just going to come up a little bit off the bottom so we don't damage our little end tip there. And we just finish off that delicate little now that there will fit absolutely beautiful and in the corner of our room. Now it's a great little tip to cut your overscribe on the end of your scotia or your skirting first before you actually measure it to length. That way if you make a little blue, you can always cut another mitre on the end of it and then redo your scotia. So cut your overscribe first and then measure off it. So that's my scotia up with the overscribe looking lovely. Now it's time to fill any holes, give your mouldings a light sand, and then you can paint them. So I've tidied up this room with a whole new set of mouldings. Scotia at the top, skirting at the bottom, and architraves around the doors and windows. It really was easy as.